Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, and I am the director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Pursuing Factual Consensus: What Does Truth Mean in the Public Square? Thank you for joining us today. I will serve as the moderator of today's discussion, and before I introduce our panelists, I want to give a bit of context for this discussion and what we at the Levin Center are hoping to accomplish today and in future conversations on this topic. Today's panel is the first of a series of discussions the Levin Center plans to hold over the next year that will explore how in America we decide what is true about important issues in public life. Specifically, we want to delve into how facts become established in the public mind and the role various institutions, including, say, legislatures and the media, play in uncovering facts and influencing the public to embrace them as true. So why are we here? Well, for perhaps the first time in American history, we are witnessing a collapse in the public's ability to separate fact from fiction, driven by public officials and their enablers in the media, who are swamping the public with so much disinformation that people don't know what is true. There is growing concern that democracy cannot long survive in an atmosphere where fact-based discourse is disappearing from our public debates. So in today's discussion, we would like to explore some fundamental questions about how we know what we know about significant issues. Where do public facts come from? And how does our constitutional system support the development of facts and the pursuit of truth? One of our core institutions that has a unique power and responsibility to conduct public inquiries and uphold a fact-based public square is the legislative branch of government. So in addition to probing how information and opinion become accepted as fact in our society, I'm hoping we can also explore how institutions such as Congress influence the public's understanding of key issues and contribute to what appears to be, let's say, an increasingly chaotic information landscape. How can we reestablish respect for norms of truthfulness among the public and within key institutions that shape public attitudes? To unpack these questions and perhaps point us towards some strategies that might help reduce the chaos in our public square, we have joining us today three experts who have studied and written about these issues from various perspectives. First, we have Mark Hetherington, professor of political science at the University of North Carolina. Mark has published extensively on the decline of political trust and the rise of polarization among the American populace, most recently in his book, Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to Four Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide, which he wrote with his colleague Jonathan Weiler. Mark's work traces the development of a partisan divide that seems to transcend politics and embed in deeply held moral and cultural beliefs, making compromise and even political tolerance less and less acceptable to many Americans. Next, we have Yana Krupnikov, professor of political science at Stony Brook University. Yana's work focuses on political attention and political expression. And most recently, she is the author of the book, The Other Divide: Polarization and Disengagement in American Politics. And some of her recent work has focused on how effective polarization undermines public support for democratic norms, such as pluralism. And finally, we have Jonathan Rauch. John is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution, and his bio is available on his website, which we can include in the chat. John's most recent book is The Constitution of Knowledge: A Defense of Truth, which describes how the US Constitution sets out a process of negotiation and power balancing within government and allows Americans the freedom to discover facts and pursue the truth in academia, in various professions, and in various settings. This entire system, John suggests, which is reliant on a good faith approach to the truth, is under an unprecedented attack from purveyors of disinformation, and that threatens the survival of our democracy. So I want to welcome all three of you and thank you for being here today. And I'd love to just jump in and maybe kick things off with a question with a quote, let's say, from the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, who, let me get this right, he said, "Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts." So the question would be, do people in our country think that is no longer the case? And if so, why? So perhaps maybe each of you could take a swing at that based on your own research, and what you're observing. And I don't know, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll take a swing at it if it would be helpful.
Sure.
So one of the things that I think is important, and I just want to preface this by saying I'm really terrified, actually by the situation that we're experiencing right now as it relates to the erosion of, or the seeming erosion of the importance of truth to people, and the fact that trust in so many institutions is on the run and so forth. But I do want to try to put this into a little bit of perspective. This notion of, people, in a sense, wanting to believe what they want to believe, not necessarily what's true. And, this is something that is human. This is something that, has been a characteristic of the Republic, since the very beginning. The idea that people believe what they want to believe is tied up in a concept in psychology that we call cognitive dissonance. When people are confronted with facts that they, would really rather not, sort of deal with, they don't. They just ignore them, or at least they do their best to brush those things to the side, to filter them out of their information processing, and instead continue to believe what they want to believe. And for a lot of the period in time that the United States has been around, we had a partisan press, which allowed people who wanted to believe what the Republicans said, or what the Whigs said, or what the Democrats said, to believe those things. And then we, for many of us at least, grew up in this period after the Second World War, when those norms started to change, where facts started to seem more important, that there was more something approaching one truth. But of course, over the course of the last 30 years or so, and the increase in the number of information streams that people have available to them, we're going back to people being allowed to believe what they want to believe again. So again, one thing I just want to make clear is it's a troubling set of circumstances, but it sure ain't new.
I could jump in and add to that. So, yeah, Mark, you make an interesting and important point. There's nothing new about people disagreeing on facts. In fact, we don't want them to agree on facts because knowledge comes from disagreement. We're usually wrong about facts. So learning happens by getting things wrong, making mistakes, making corrections. So Senator Moynihan wasn't quite right about that. But what he was right about is that we need some basic consensus on the mechanism that we use for concluding what the facts are for public purposes. On questions like who won an election, for example. It's not all that important if a lot of people think that Princess Diana is still alive, as apparently they do, or that Elvis Presley is alive. But should we send them a social security check? It's important to keep government and journalism and research and law fact-based. And the problem now becomes specifically, first, that you have a very vigorous, active disinformation economy, extremely active in the MAGA movement, which is, of course, very influential in the Republican Party, very active in conservative media. And second, the disagreements that they're fostering, the disinformation that they're using, directly affects the policy issues that public consensus is most important on, like who won the election. It's not a great thing that until recently, most Americans did not believe in the theory of evolution. We'd like them to be more scientifically literate, but okay, people are people. When it comes to who won the election, That's the ballgame that puts us into the ungovernability territory, and that's the reason I'm worried.
So I think in terms of what we think about as facts, the complicated part of politics is that politics is something that is intangible to most people. It's something that they experience largely from the media environment. It's to go all the way back to 1922 and quote Walter Lippmann, it's the pictures in our heads. It's pictures in our heads of things that we feel happening to us, like we feel high prices and inflation and the formula shortage. But a lot of these things are extraordinarily abstract. And when a lot of these things become abstract, people become extraordinarily reliant on elites, and they become extraordinarily reliant on the media. And when there is an expansion of who we see as kind of media, who we see as handing down facts, more people start to take in information that isn't necessarily good. But in this abstraction of politics, it's become something that people basically adapt. So it's kind of one aspect of it. The other thing that I want to think about in terms of facts versus opinions is that there's this idea in political psychology and political science and psychology in general called motivated reasoning, which is that we are motivated to come to the conclusion that's going to be best for us. And I think there's currently this feeling that if we could just get people the right information, like if we could somehow kind of get through their screens and be like, oh, this is wrong, you have to believe this thing never happened, it's false, people are lying to you. That if somebody could do this, if we could come up with a magic formula, people would assimilate those facts and they would suddenly say, oh my goodness, my entire worldview and opinion has been based on a lie. These elites have been lying to me. The media have been lying to me. But with motivated reasoning, I think we have to think about a different causal chain, right? What if it's not the information that came first and the opinion that came second? What if it's the opinion that came first? And then in this enormous media environment, we found something that looked like a fact to support their opinion. There's research to suggest that when people are told they're misinformed, they simply try to find another way in which their opinion could have been correct. And so I think in terms of this interaction of facts and opinions, there's certainly, right, certainly a huge, tremendous problem of disinformation. But I think this problem runs deeper than just trying to get people the right facts. Because once there is an opinion, once somebody has committed very deeply to an opinion, it becomes really difficult to move them away from that place, even with the most accurate scientific information possible. So at that part, I think that's where there's this tension in terms of what is truth, what is fact, and how this relates to where people are at politically.
So I hear you. So sort of weaving together all three of your comments. One of the things that seems that you seem to agree on, or that there seems to be a common thread among you, is a belief that it isn't really the fact itself so much that's important. It's more having an ability to, well, it's more the process, or the ability to grant some level of legitimacy to people you disagree with. It seems like part of our challenge here is that we may not agree on facts, but the sort of the norms that used to prevail around hearing other people or hearing other opinions, that seems to have diminished to some degree. And some people ascribe this to an increase in polarization. And I know that all of you have written about polarization and kind of what it is, and I wonder if you could maybe one way to get at this would be to talk about the role that polarization plays in our inability to agree on even some norms for talking to each other, let alone the facts maybe that ought to inform our public policy. So is polarization sort of the cause of this, or is it sort of an outgrowth of other things in this, crisis of facts that we have? Mark, you want to maybe go first with that?
Sure. Well, one thing that I think is really important, and Jana made reference to it, and that is the role that our leaders, our elites, play in this whole process. One of the things that I think is really important as to why we used to agree more on the facts, 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, is because Republican and Democratic leaders, the president, the majority leader, minority leader, and so forth, they agreed on the facts, and we as ordinary people, followed our leaders, and so our opinions about what was fact and what was not fact, tended to be more similar. That seems to have departed over time, at least to some degree. Different sides seem to be more inclined to adopt different fact sets, or at least interpretation of those facts of late. And John talked about the election outcome as being one of those perfect examples in that sense. And again, what we have is partisans following their leaders. It's not like 60% of Democrats think the election was rigged. It's 60% of Republicans who do. Why? Because Republicans are following the Republican leader. But let me talk a little bit of how I think polarization plays into this as well. What polarization does, I think, to use one of the terms Jana used, is it provides us with motivation, motivation to believe our side, or motivation to disbelieve the other side and its view of things. So most of the polarization that we're seeing in the United States these days is affective, how we feel, okay? And it's not really how we feel about our own side. Democrats feel about the same way about the Democratic Party now as they did 50 years ago. What's changed is how much we hate the other side, right? So, we've gone from, feeling pretty neutrally if we're a Democrat about Republicans, or Democrats about Republicans, Republicans about Democrats, to absolutely hating our opponents. Now that's motivation. That's motivation to see the world the way you want to see it, not the way the other side sees it. And I just sort of suggest this about, you guys are probably all better people than I am. You probably don't hate anybody. I do. There are a couple people. And I have strong motivation to believe everything bad about those people. If I'm confronted with facts that might suggest otherwise, I have strong motivation to continue to believe what I want to believe. And that's, so polarization, I think, plays the role of, freezing people in place against what the other side, says is true or believes.
Others want to jump into this, or shall we?
Well, I'd like to say a few words.
Sure.
I don't want anyone to feel there's a regular rotation or crowd out Jana. So yeah, there's an intimate relation between propagandization and polarization, and in fact, they're two sides of the same coin. When Vladimir Putin uses Russian trolls at the Internet Research Agency to drum up opposing protests on opposite sides of the street in Texas, and I think also Montana, in 2016, when he is driving a wedge through pre-existing divisions in American society in order to widen them, which was the focus of Russian propaganda. Why is he doing that? It's because he understands that a polarized society is a weaker society. It is less united. He also understands that the more polarized the society becomes, the more I hate the other guys, the more, therefore, I'm willing to believe conspiracy theories and lies around the other side. And that means the more I propagandize, the more I polarize, the more I polarize, the more I propagandize, you get into the kind of spiral that we're seeing now, where you can actually have a lot of political influence, or you can make money by working this way. You can apply this in US politics as well. I would argue, this will sound partisan to some, I think it's just a fact. Folks can draw their own conclusions. Donald Trump was a master of this. He did not have to tweet out last April 2020, liberate Michigan. That was a deliberate effort to polarize the country around mask wearing. Why would he do that? That's not good for the country. It's probably not good for anybody, but creating that polarization revs up the juices that he thrives on. So yeah, there's an intimate relationship between these two things, polarization and propagandization. They feed each other.
So I just want to jump in really quickly with something potentially extraordinarily boring. But
please go ahead.
But I think this boring thing is actually quite important, and that is survey measurement. Everything that we're talking about here is so heavily dependent on people, usually survey firms or researchers, asking people a bunch of questions about how they feel about the other party, asking people a bunch of questions about how they behave, asking people about their opinions. And what we know is that when it comes to kind of picturing the country, measurement really matters. How you ask people these very questions is going to give us a really different perspective on how people feel about the other side, what issues they're going to support, what policy they believe should be passed. So I think when we talk about at least characterizing, we are polarized or these people are polarized, it's really important to kind of keep in mind that there's a lot of measurement variation in who exactly is polarized, what exactly these people are polarized about, right? It matters, for example, how you describe the other party in terms of measuring polarization. There's excellent research by Jamie Druckman and Matt Lewandowski that points that people genuinely, to use Mark's term, hate the leaders of the other side, are kind of more ambivalent about the voters of the other side. So I think measurement is kind of extraordinarily important here. The other thing I think is really to keep in mind is that when we think about polarization, there's currently an extraordinarily strong media narrative of America as a polarized society. And I agree with this. We are undergoing a tremendous historical component of polarization. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the stories that bubble to the surface are stories that rely on a polarization narrative. There's great research by Josh Darr and Joanna Dunaway, for example, that points to the idea that the most extreme congressperson people are likely to get the most coverage. The more extreme your speeches, the more likely you are to be covered. There's other research to suggest that if you give an extreme partisan quote, you are more likely to appear as a kind of a vox populi, voice of the people in an article. So I think to some extent, when we think about polarization, we again have to think of what are we measuring, who are we capturing, and what are the pictures in our heads, right? There's certainly a group of people in this country who are tremendously polarized, who I think would not hesitate to use Mark's terms that they hate the other side. But I often think that it may be a bit sort of more nuanced than at least the media coverage allows us to see.
So Jana, one of the more interesting emanations of what you just said is that as polarized as Americans are, people believe typically on both sides that the other side is approximately twice as extreme in terms of their policy views and their positions and their attitudes as they actually are. So one of the things that's happening is that people have an exaggerated concept of how much the other side hates them. And one of the things it turns out that's actually effective against polarization, of course, you can't get rid of it, but you can greatly reduce it, is to inform people actually what the other side really believes. They're not as different as you think they are. Yeah, they're different. But part of the problem here is the cycle you mentioned. We're in a cycle of media, social media, politics, when it seems to be in a lot of people's interest to create an exaggerated sense of how polarized we really are. And that's, of course, a way of fueling polarization.
So I 100% agree with that. So I've actually written a couple of papers on this very topic in terms of the idea that people kind of misrepresent some of the other side. And it's true. People believe that the other side is all extraordinarily ideological, and they believe that the other side is doing nothing but talking about politics literally all the time. But they themselves are kind of like, but I'm cool, like, right? I'm not constantly talking about highly ideological politics. And so on my side either as well. So yeah, I do think it's a tremendous cycle of these images in our head of what the other side looks like.
Yeah, but it does give us something to work with in terms of maybe a way into reversing some of these spirals.
One thing that I think is pretty interesting as it relates to the pandemic, in particular, there's this, I think, assumption among Democrats that because almost all Republicans voted for Donald Trump, that they all agree with him on the issues. And one of the things that came out of our survey work during 2000 was that, well, I do this as sort of a parlor game, which points up just how boring my parlor must be. But about asking people what percentage of Republicans do you think supported mask mandates at the time of the 2020 election? And in liberal Chapel Hill, usually the answer I get is 10, 15, it's 70. Percent of Republicans supported mask mandates. More than half of Republicans are vaccinated. These are, incredible misunderstandings that we have of the other side. I think that's really noteworthy.
So let me jump in with a question, because this is something in reading sort of all of your writing and something that I want to unpack a little bit because of something, Jana, that you suggested. Because it refers to some things that you've written about, it's sort of political junkies have a disproportionate influence on the culture and on how people perceive politics, and how analysts tend to view it, that there's this narrative of polarization that doesn't actually hold up when you look at surveys of how much ordinary Americans, whoever they are, actually are engaged with politics. So would you talk about that a little bit, and kind of related to this conversation, because it sounds like one of the ways to back away from polarization or to have it dominate us less would be to engage people on other things, engage people with more the substance of governing, as opposed to, the junior high popularity fight that seems to be politics now.
So I think kind of the idea that you're pointing to, that my recent co-author book covers, is this idea of what we term the attention divide, which is that there are some people who are kind of profoundly, deeply engaged in politics. We call them deeply involved. And then there's basically everyone else, right? And this everyone else involves, has a minority of people who are paying basically no attention, but the bulk of the everyone else kind of might watch the news. They know big things that are happening in politics. When we look at the levels of divisions and polarization, this animosity, kind of to bring it back to Mark's point, this idea of hating the other side is extraordinarily high among these people who are really, really, really engaged in politics. I'm not going to say that the other group of people are kind of in love with the other side, but it's more of a feeling of ambivalence rather than this sort of kind of deep-seated hatred. So what I think this suggests is, again, this nuance in the level of interest, but it's also this nuance in the level of voice, right? The people who are deeply involved in politics, they aren't just following politics. They are the ones on social media talking about politics. They're actually, as really recent research suggests, they're more willing to take surveys. There is this work, I think co-authored with Josh Clinton, that suggests that people who are really engaged in politics are really excited to take surveys. They're really excited to share their opinions. So by virtue of kind of this engagement with politics, by virtue of their willingness to talk about where they are kind of driving this conversation. They're going to have more voice in the media. They're going to have more voice in surveys. They're going to characterize a lot of these pictures of what we think politics looks like. So what do we do about this? Well, that's a tough question, right? On just kind of again, sort of a more, I guess, boring level, we should figure out what's happening in surveys, and if they are in fact overrepresenting these people who care quite a bit about politics, right? In fact, a recent paper would suggest that part of the increase in polarization is part of this change in who's taking surveys. I think another question is to maybe kind of look more deeply at the various issues that come to the forefront. Are they coming to the forefront because they are being pushed by this, we find 20% of people who are deeply engaged and deeply polarized? Are these issues reflective of what this kind of less expressive, less vocal populace also cares about? But I think another thing is, again, to return, I think, to John's point about the idea of basically, do these 20%, is that who we picture when we think of the other side, right? Are we thinking of the person who's constantly on Twitter talking about their politics, or are we thinking of just kind of an average voter?
I guess I would only caution that we can psychologize a bit too much and institutionalize sometimes too little. And to go back to the original topic, the core topic, which is facts, information, disinformation, all of the things that Yanni, that you just said are important. But focusing on the individual level can miss the equally, if not more important point, that what we've seen in the last 5 years in America is, for the first time ever, maybe since the 1850s in the South, but the first time we've seen the institutionalization of Russian-style mass disinformation employed by domestic actors against this country. It begins in the campaign, when, according to fact checkers, 70% of Donald Trump's checkable statements were either entirely or mostly false. Hillary Clinton's comparable number was 25%. 70% is not an accident. It continues on Inauguration Day, when the first two things he does, literally, are put out disinformation on the size of his inaugural crowd and lie about whether it rained during the inauguration. Now, these are transparent lies, right? What's the point? The point is Putinism, to exert sovereignty over truth. He then compiles misinformation at a rate of, well, 30,000 false checked claims. That's 20 a day, according to the Washington Post fact check, and it culminates in Stop the Steal, the most effective and audacious disinformation campaign that's ever been run in the United States, and one that's left a majority of the Republican Party believing falsely that the election was stolen. So we need to understand this isn't just happening. This is being done to us by active agents who are sophisticated in their understanding of how to confuse, disorient, and deceive the public. I realize that will sound partisan to some, and there are also big problems on the left. We can talk about cancel culture, for example, and the way it distorts reality, and social media and how it distorts reality. But I don't think we should shrink from naming Russian-style mass disinformation when it's being used by domestic actors.
And if I could piggyback on that, John, I mean, and without any punishment at all from the Republicans or Trump's co-partisans. So another trivia question: what incumbent president, what president running for re-election got the highest percentage of support according to exit polls from his co-partisans? Ronald Reagan in 1984, you would think, Morning in America, he won with nearly 60% of the vote. No, it's Donald Trump. He got 94% of the vote from Republicans in 2020, despite the fact that there were 200,000 dead from COVID and all of the economic dislocation that was taking place because of the pandemic. We could argue, oh, well, it wasn't really his fault, all that economic dislocation, and the pandemic was not of his making. But one of the really important strains in political science is that leaders get punished for things that are not their fault all the time. It doesn't have to be their fault, for bad things to happen to them. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and bad things happen. But hey, guess what? Among Republicans, none of it mattered. And among enough independents, it did, to lead to a change in outcomes. But, to put it into, some perspective, Biden got 1.1% more of the two-party vote than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. It's pretty staggering. That's polarization.
Mm-hmm. So I want to take a little bit of a detour to respond to or to put forward an audience question. This is a little bit of a history walk down history lane. Speaking of Ronald Reagan's administration, once upon a time there was a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, as you're all aware, and that was a regulation, FCC regulation that had been in place for some time in the 1980s when it was repealed. And so we have an audience member who's asking the question: to what extent do you think that change has helped bring us to the place we are now? And I think it'll open up kind of a conversation about the media, not just social media, but the traditional media, that is probably worth having too. So what do you think about the Fairness Doctrine? How influential was it before, and how much does it play in what we're talking about?
Well, I'm a member of the media and came up in the time of the Fairness Doctrine. So maybe I can start on that.
Sure.
I remember it well. I started my first newspaper job was in 1983. And the Fairness Doctrine had its place, but it was designed for a much different universe. It was designed for a world in which you had, well, first of all, it never applied to print. It applied to TV. And the rationale was that TV was using scarce spectrum space, and there were only 3 networks. And I think it did actually in some ways positively shape the product and the aspiration of the product, which is, you can't go all in on the business model of confirmation bias confirmation, but it was doomed. There's no way to maintain that kind of rule when you've got dozens, hundreds of cable channels, an infinite variety of online YouTubers. So I think it's become irrelevant, and we've got to learn to live in a world where we're going to have to figure out how to establish both norms at the personal and institutional level, and also, very important thing, how to improve the product design of things like Twitter, for example, Facebook, Instagram, all the others, improve the product design so that they behave in less sociopathic and disruptive ways.
Yana, Mark, any comments on that?
The only thing I think I could add is that the Fairness Doctrine ends in 1987, and the problems really don't start to metastasize until much later than that. So I think John's point is well made. It was designed for a different time and a different media environment, and it's not clear that it would really have any influence over what's happening these days.
Well, let me stay on
in
the
their
media.
way. Just as a codicil, in their way, I realized that Facebook and Twitter and their other social media platforms' efforts at content moderation are controversial. They're bound to be controversial, but in a way, what they're groping for is to try to figure out institutional norms and rules that will replicate aspects of the Fairness Doctrine. And that's, if we're going to do it, that's the path. It's got to be social and institutional. I don't think it can be legal.
Mm-hmm. I want to stay on the media for a minute more, because when I conceive of this spiraling polarization that we experience, I think of it as sort of there's sort of 3 aspects to it. One is a public that is incredibly frustrated to begin with, and the roots of that can come from, it certainly can come from what they're consuming in the media, but can also just be the objective conditions that they're experiencing, right? They're over many decades, they've watched government not really solve some very important problems and lose credibility because of big high-profile scandals that have definitely diminished people's faith in the government. Then you have a media environment, that is recognizing that there's a lot of money to be made in outrage. And then you have politicians who pick up on that and realize there's a lot of political gain to be had in gaining attention by being outrageous and by denying the credibility or the legitimacy of the other side, right? So I'm interested in how that spiral, if you agree at all with kind of that formulation. I did a lot of ways to nuance that, I realized. What is the media's role in sort of not addressing the first thing, which is those objective conditions? There's a lot of, there are a lot of people writing about this these days. There's a lot of horse race media media coverage, there's a lot of coverage of, the kind of inside game in Washington, but not so much coverage about, except occasional investigative reports, but the sort of day-to-day coverage is about the sausage making as opposed to sort of what we get out of the sausage ultimately. Do you agree with that? And do you think that has a role in causing people to distrust institutions and sort of give up on the whole thing and just go off into their opinion, echo chambers?
Well, again, I'll insert myself. Hope I'm not being too aggressive, but as a member of the media. So I have a controversial view on institutional failure. I think it's more that Americans have failed their institutions than the other way around. And that's a longer conversation. But whenever I ask people which earlier period in American life institutions would they rather have, which other countries' institutions would they rather have, they don't really come up with an answer, except now and then they say Scandinavia. To me, the miracle is our institutions are functioning as well as they are, given the pressure they're under. And in terms of the media, yeah, there is a problem with too much opinion and opinion displacing fact. But the reason for that is not that the media have become corrupt and don't want to cover the facts. It's because of the collapse of the business model for reporting. I can speak to this. I journalists being laid off left and right, news deserts, entire local areas where there is no one to cover the school board. I just got back from North Carolina. When I worked down there, there were reporters from papers around the state at the state capitol. Now I was told there's one. And even that may be endangered. It's expensive to gather news. You got to have a person there at every school board meeting. And that's disappearing largely because there's no financial model to support it. That's a big worry. And of course, one of the things we learned, Jana may be acquainted with this literature, is when local news goes away, people rely more on national news, issues get nationalized, and those issues are more polarizing. So we get another pathway to polarization from the collapse of local news.
Well, so John took my comment, which was going to be that the collapse of local news is actually pointing to this nationalization, which creates more polarization. But it's exactly what I was going to say. And there's this kind of great research by, again, Josh Darr and Joanna Dunaway, in which they do kind of this kind of wonderful field experiment in which they kind of have they shift what local newspapers cover, right? Fewer national issues. And they actually do see declines in polarization in these areas. So local news kind of focusing on local issues, I think would be extraordinarily, or at least research suggests to be extraordinarily beneficial to this kind of nationalized, polarized environment that we're in.
Yeah, it would be fun to ask the participants how many of them subscribe, pay money to their local newspaper, or what's left to their local newspaper. I'm betting you'll find that most do not.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, the key thing, that comes out of my research is that, back when Americans were more divided along an axis that was about how big government ought to be, that was complicated. They weren't experts on that. Difficult for them to have extraordinarily strong feelings about it. And, you can make compromises about, taxes and spending. That was, sort of our, great old New Deal time. It's as the cultural issues that, both of you were talking about, as they become ascendant, what we think of now as national issues, gay rights, same-sex marriage, immigration, and so forth. Those are the things that people apparently have such strong feelings about.
Well, we have a couple of additional audience questions that I'd like to bring into the conversation. One of them dealing with the media. So one of our audience members is asking, what should they read? Well, if you're trying to avoid, to broaden your media consumption habits, avoid the traps, that political junkies fall into or maybe create. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts about how to approach media consumption? Anybody?
Well, I do, but I've taken the lead about 3 times in a row, so I don't want to step.
All right, somebody else.
Maybe I should pull back a bit. Somebody else.
Well, I'll offer sort of a really kind of, I think, a simple kind of thing here. And this is sort of based on some research on the use of Twitter as public opinion. So I would sort of say that whenever there is a news article that begins with people tweeting as a signal of public opinion, that should be a sign of caution. Because you're getting, I see these all the time actually, which is people are upset about X and it's just some tweets. And so I think whenever something like this comes up, it's sort of necessary to sort of step back for a second and kind of say, people or, a couple of tweets that you have come across. I think another thing is to look at how survey data are being used in the news. What's being reported to you? Where is the surveys coming from? Who is in the survey? Can you actually click through to the survey and see what question was actually asked? And another thing, this kind of goes to Mark's point earlier about data on things like support for mask wearing and vaccination and things like that. Stories often begin with looking at partisan gaps, but I also think it's sort of interesting to, again, look at where the data is coming from, click through and consider the size of the gap versus the proportion of the group that is actually doing something. I think that's kind of one aspect of it. There's this great paper by Katie Searles and co-authors that demonstrates that out of a population of all the polls taken during an election, journalists were systematically more likely to cover polls that showed that the election was very, very close and excluded polls that didn't suggest kind of a competition. So to often think about kind of what the data are, where they're coming from, how they came to be, and especially what was the question that was being asked. Citing as people believe this thing.
Yeah, one thing I would add is, just the notion of a varied diet of information sources. One of the things that I'm always struck by, and it's something that happens at least on a weekly basis and maybe more often, is when I read something that's written from an ideological perspective, not mine, that I often am struck by, oh, that's a much more reasonable argument than I thought that it would be. What we do when we're on one side of the political divide or another is we attribute arguments to our opponents that might or might not actually be the case. What confronting arguments made by the other side often makes you do is, well, first of all, understand what the other side, why the other side believes what it does. And then it also causes you to interrogate your own opinions in a way that you might not otherwise do. And usually, when you do that, it actually tends to moderate your beliefs about things as opposed to, make them increasingly extreme.
Yeah, all that. And I would add some things I do is I advocate relying on mainstream media primarily. It's still pretty good. And one criterion for that is I look for outlets, whether they're left, right, or center, that will run corrections if they're found to be wrong. 100 years ago, the American Society of Newspaper Editors formed. And first thing it did was formulate some guidelines for journalism and ethical code. Things like try to be objective, run corrections if you're wrong. If you say something about someone, run it past them. Until then, people actually didn't reliably do those things. They became core to journalism, and they're still core to responsible journalism. And there are organizations like, I think, NewsGuard, if it's still around, which is rating news organizations based on their adherence to these standards. So I try to get a varied diet of news organizations that are serious about being accountable if they're wrong. That means Wall Street Journal plus Washington Post plus NPR online, plus a couple of conservative outlets. National Review, I think, is very good reason if you're a libertarian. Pulling these things together in a varied diet allows me to triangulate. So that's how I approach it.
I'd like to add something from the perspective of the work we do here at the Levin Center. one of the reasons that we do what we do and promote this work of fact-finding by lawmakers, promoting it and developing it and improving the sort of the technology of it, is that Senator Levin believed fervently in the benefit of sort of what, Mark, you were describing, which is what you get out of working with people, of seeing things from the other side, from the perspective of people you disagree with. And so when somebody engages in an investigative activity and they're partnered with people they really disagree with, they tend to have to be on their game because they know there's going to be somebody next to them who's looking at the same set of facts or maybe thinking about a similar set of issues from a very different perspective. And it does two things. As I said, it raises people's performance because they really have to think critically about their own approach. But it also creates a certain amount of empathy and understanding that the other side may not be quite as crazy as I think they are, because you're getting some insight into their reasoning. And I think John and Jana, both your perspectives are similar to this in the sense that you're trying to get a broader view, not necessarily to compromise with yourself or whatever, but to get a sense of what the sort of whole polity is thinking. And that's what we seem to be losing.
Yeah, there's this term in science, which I think also applies here, consilience, which is what is it that leads scientists to think maybe something is actually true and drives consensus? It's not a vote. One of the major ways is if different fields doing independent research begin to coalesce around a proposition, that's usually pretty good evidence. And I think the same is true in media. If you begin to see different branches of media coming at it from different perspectives, begin to coalesce around something, that's a pretty good indicator that that's likely to be true.
The only caveat I would add to that is it has to be serious. If you were to take a liberal and sit them in front of OAN, it would probably just cause their head to explode. It would cause anger and outrage and stuff like that. In fact, there have been studies done involving Fox News and MSNBC, that suggest that exact backfire effect. In the case of what Jonathan's getting at here, I think it's right, but it's got to be serious journalism as opposed to something that's just mere entertainment for the base.
Mm-hmm. All right, I want to pick up on another audience question that kind of goes in a different direction. A member of the audience points out that Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board has recently paused or been paused in just 3 weeks after it was officially announced. And the audience member is asking, should we view disinformation as a critical national security threat? John, I think you would be answering yes in that regard, based on what I heard what you said earlier.
Yeah, I think I would. I'd like to get your take on this, actually. You've been out there in Congress in the not too distant past. Yeah, I think it is a threat, and I think it's a threat both externally and internally. The external threat is manipulation by foreign powers like Russia primarily, but also China, Iran, North Korea are now playing the disinformation game, working the social media and other media networks, using bots, trolls, disinformation, misinformation, repetition, all of these other tactics. These don't necessarily change a lot of people's minds, but they're designed to cause confusion, distraction, make us question the outcome of the 2016 election, as they successfully did. The bigger threat, as I mentioned, is internal, which is that powerful and sophisticated tactics of disinformation are now in use by American actors in the MAGA movement. And once that genie's out of the bottle, we're going to be dealing with it for a long time. The best way to deal with targeted, sophisticated disinformation in a democracy is not to have it in the first place. And we succeeded in not having it in the first place, starting after the Civil War. But now we're going to have to deal with it. These are tools that not just MAGA can use. The left can use them. Anybody can use tools of mass disinformation. And that means that we're going to have to harden ourselves, become more sophisticated in how we understand news, get better civic news literacy, get better product design from social media platforms. The questioner mentioned, however, the new Disinformation Governance Board, and that looks like it's maybe a fiasco. I think the hardest thing to do, and probably something we shouldn't even try, would be a governmental response to domestic disinformation, because it gets too much like censorship and thought control. I think we're going to have to rely for domestic disinformation on studying things, understanding them better, and engaging responses in the level of lots of civil society and institutions and individuals. That said, maybe this new board, once it stands up, maybe gets a better name, figures things out, maybe it can be a resource in doing some of the analysis that needs to be done. But I think that's probably the best zone for it to stay.
Others? Well, John, you asked what I think. I mean, I agree. I think it is a serious national security problem. And I think I'm inclined to agree that that staying out of kind of content, worrying about content that's getting out there is that the government shouldn't be doing that. Resources should probably be more focused on funding good efforts to enhance civil discourse and civic education nationally, particularly with younger people. That does not seem to be a very robustly supported area. And if we could replicate what goes on, when people read are exposed to various perspectives, broadly disagreeing perspectives, if the kind of thing that we try to model with respect to how an investigation that involves broadly disagreeing people going after the facts together, that kind of experience that could be replicated, and if young people or just people of all kinds, all ages could get more engaged with that experience, I think it would help people be more tolerant and be more civically respectful of their neighbors. I think the government
seems exactly.
Yeah,
that seems exactly right. And if I could riff on that for just a minute, in just these past few months, we have seen what scholars are now saying is probably the most successful example of counter disinformation at the government level that we've ever seen. And that's the Biden administration's use of declassification to do what's called pre-bunking, which is where you warn the public of what kind of disinformation they're likely to see from the enemy, the antagonist, and thus harden a lot of people to it. They got in there and discovered that the Russians were likely to use actors to create false propaganda about Ukrainian military offenses. They warned us. People are saying this is going to be a textbook operation, and it happened because so many more people in the government have so much more of a sophisticated understanding of the power of information warfare and how the Russians and other actors are deploying it. So we are making some very significant progress in terms of hardening ourselves to these tactics. And there's a lot government can do without trying to control, dominate, censor content, which it should never do.
One hesitation is, the example of pre-bunking that you use, of course, is Russian action in Ukraine, not really a partisan issue. And this in contrast, the election, so to go back to one of Jana's earlier points, you got to keep in mind that when people have directional goals about what they want to believe, new information might not make any difference at all. I think we as academics are like, oh yeah, more information, it's always good. Maybe not. It's certainly not bad, or it's unlikely to be bad, but it's very unlikely to make a change in people who are motivated to see it a different way in what their views are. So I talked about the directional goals that people have. They have directional goals to believe their party. They don't necessarily have goals that are based on what scholars would call accuracy. what I think the key for us is to figure out is what increases people's desire to see the world accurately as opposed to directionally. In a highly partisan environment, we want to see it directionally, that make us feel good about what our side is and what they're doing and stuff like that. That might be accurate, but it might not, So, what might foster people's willingness to break from their directional goals and embrace accuracy goals? And I don't know that it's just like the right thing, it's got to be something heavier than that.
So if I could do a brief advertisement for, I think, a good example of one way to get at this, there's an organization I've been involved with, originally a board member, now just, an evangelist, called Braver Angels. It's a national grassroots depolarizing movement. It is a movement. No one is paid. It's in all 50 states. It's hosting workshops and debates between reds and blues. And the goal here is to get at the phenomenon Jana and I were talking about earlier, false polarization. It turns out when people encounter each other in structured conversations and really listen to each other, the most common reactions, they walk away saying, we're not as divided as we've been led to believe. And to the extent that we can begin rebuilding some of these ways of talking to each other, hearing each other, understanding who the person really is, not the caricature on Twitter or on Fox News, we reduce our vulnerability to the kind of polarization and propagandization that we see. And, I'm not without hope that America has civic resources to do more of this. I think maybe we can, and I think maybe we're starting to see it.
I think that's really interesting. I've actually checked out Braver Angels. And I find it pretty compelling, just anecdotally. Mark or Jana, are you aware of any research that delves into how those kinds of approaches work, whether they work, or what kind of lessons they might have for us?
So there's really great work by Matt Lewandowski that he actually brought people into rooms to talk across party in person, us obviously pre-pandemic. And what Matt finds is that having these conversations leads to these sort of more positive interactions, leads to depolarization. And then there's also more recent work, I think it's David Brookman, who they brought people in to talk via Zoom, so during the pandemic, and sort of leading to similar, at least short-term outcomes. So there's some evidence that putting people at least in the same place to talk is sort of beneficial. I do want to kind of emphasize that in these cases, these are people who, at least on certain levels, agreed at least about the norms of democracy and institutions. I'm not certain that kind of folks who are on the sort of extreme fringes are actually making it into these studies in order to see how conversation affects there. So you have to have some sort of baseline of support for democracy.
Yes, of course. There are two caveats to this model. One is you can't just throw people together in conversation any more than you can take a husband and wife in a bad marriage and say, talk it out. It needs to be a structured and guided conversation. And that's the key, structure and guidance, like a marriage counselor. And the second thing is, no, it's not for everyone. But what we're trying to do here isn't make everyone love each other down to each individual. It's to reestablish a critical mass of people who, despite their disagreements, believe they can talk to the other side. And when you put it that way, I think it sounds doable.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just add two things, and maybe three if I get really ambitious. The first one is, I love the idea of conversation. The one thing in terms of guiding people through it that I would really emphasize across party lines or ideological lines is find something to talk about other than politics. Go build a house together, go, do a project, I think, again, the last thing that you really want to do is, remind people of their differences as opposed to their similarities. For most people, politics doesn't matter that much. So that's like, one tiny sliver of their life. The other 90% is just being a person. So emphasize, the commonalities that exist in that 90%, and maybe you can do something about the distaste about the 10% that is politics. The second thing that I'll bring up is, in terms of like, promoting accuracy, we've done a little bit of research on this here. I'm involved with a paper involving several folks where emotions can break through, this desire to see the world the way you want to see it. So, I mentioned the fact that 70% of Republicans were supportive of mask mandates, despite the fact that their party leaders were saying mask mandates are a terrible thing. How is that the case? Well, what we find is the people who broke from the party line were scared. They were really afraid of getting sick. And if you're really afraid of getting sick, your accuracy goals go up and your directional goals go down. So, in a weird way, fear can be our friend, well, anxiety is the one emotion that, for the most part, shows some sort of plus side to experiencing it and improving, people's willingness to search for information and to take protective behaviors and things like that. Can be a bad thing, but in this case, probably a plus. And then the other thing that I think is really useful for us to think about is choosing who our spokespeople are. If we start from, Jana's point that we're not as far apart as all that, can we take advantage of that? Because Republicans aren't going to listen to Democrats, liberals are not going to listen to conservatives, but you will listen to people who are, or you're more likely to listen to people who are actually on your side, but who might have a different opinion from you. So we did, Tim Ryan and one of my co-authors here and a set of other people, we did this really neat study on vaccine uptake. And we created a public service announcement starring Donald Trump, who got vaccinated and thinks it's a good idea. And we did a randomized controls study in 1,000 counties that got the Trump PSA, compared it with 1,000 counties that didn't, all had relatively low vaccination rates. And guess what? We increased vaccinations by over 100,000 vaccinations based on a $100,000 campaign. So in other words, Trump can communicate with other Republicans. When there are those breaks, where the opportunities are many, where a partisan takes a counter stereotypical position relative to the party, where persuasion can matter.
I love that study. I just heard about that from some of your colleagues. There's another relevant aspect of this too. There's a new field that's emerging. It's still kind of in embryo, but it's called cognitive immunity or cognitive immunology, and it takes concepts from literal immunology and applies them to memes that spread like viruses, disinformation, which is tuned now very carefully to occupy our minds, to outrage us, to make us want to spread them. And Mark, building on the point you just make, it says, so how can we create the equivalent of, in public health, the kind of stopgaps against spread? And one way to do that may be trusted people in the community. They might be pastors, for example, or doctors, or politicians in your own camp who you trust, who are willing to step forward and sort of slow down the disinformation. It's all you need to do. You don't need to stop it completely. You never will, humans being humans. But if you can slow it down enough to give people time to think and respond to it, that makes a big difference. So these kinds of tactics are the sorts of gradual, but I think ultimately, hopefully, cumulatively effective tactics that we're looking for.
I want to get to another audience question that changes speaking of changing the subject or talking about something other than sort of our most hot button issues or least an issue. I guess this frame is not as hot as it used to be, I suppose. An audience member asks, where does class come into all of this? And could class consciousness become something that could bridge these divides? It's certainly, we all know, that obviously in prior bygone eras, people from different classes or people from the same class, but having different other beliefs on other things, were able to come together and support, say, the New Deal. Where do you see class fitting into this, and whether it's something that could become a bridge that reduces polarization?
I'll take a swing at this, but it's mostly to say I don't know. But I'll make an observation. The observation is this: when our politics was more class-based during, the New Deal era, when income was a dividing line between Republicans and Democrats, we seemed to do okay on the polarization front. Income is actually not any longer a highly predictive thing as it relates to party. Instead, education is. And that seems to have changed things. I don't know why precisely, but as we've moved away from at least economic class in terms as measured by income and moved towards educational attainment and dividing us, that seems to have created something quite different.
Any other thoughts about that? Yeah, I'm really not sure. Go ahead, John.
I was looking to Jana, who probably knows the research on this better, but yeah, education is the new class. And there is a tendency now to divide along lines so that people who are not college educated cluster more and more in the Republican Party. And these two groups, more and less educated, take oppositional stances to each other. And this is both a change and a challenge.
So I wanted to stay on this theme of getting of exploring ways in which we can make the conversation, the public conversation, less divisive, by asking you about something we touched on before, which had to do with local media and what was, sort of the challenges of local media. And that is, if you were asked, where do you think this, if we are going to make progress, do you think that the focus might be better spent on kind of local government or local issues, or will people be able to overcome and see that really these things that divide us are less important if they can be, increase their focus on, kind of local issues that may have less of that national, may have less connection to these national issues that divide us so much?
Mark, maybe you? I have thoughts, but yours are probably better informed.
Well, I doubt they're better. I think what I would say is yes, that would help. But, that would be point A. Point B is good luck with that. It's just, I think unlikely to happen, for many of the reasons, that we talked about, already. Local media is collapsing, as an institution. And then, there's this whole thing, like, one of the things, so when I first started to do, this research on, what divides us, what are the specific ideas that divide us? And, certain of those things seem to be less divisive than others. And, my first thought is, well, why don't we talk more about the less divisive issues, then we'll be less divided. Well, here's a problem with that. People want to talk about the more divisive ones because they're more, emotionally engaging. As it relates to media models, it gets more clicks, it gets more eyes on the screen, it gets, all of those things. So, for me, the thing, that grows us out of this is, where the incentives to do what is being done right now, those incentives have to change, for some reason or another. So one side starts losing all the elections. That would be, an example of an incentive where we start to focus on, different issues. Maybe, race or immigration or, whatever becomes, such a loser for one side, that, that they just can't continue to go there. And then, they look for another, issue to talk about. But, I think if we're looking for change, it has to be rooted in the incentives that elite actors have to change politics.
Yeah, I think that's right. We haven't talked about social media much. Maybe we should,
Yeah, I was hoping we could get to that.
Stuff,
yep.
But that's also been a force toward nationalization of everything. I'm old enough to remember when Tip O'Neill was speaker and his favorite saying, all politics is local, and now all politics is national. And that makes everything more difficult. Social media, I think, contributes to that.
Just to quickly add, so just putting the whole polarization component aside, there's so much lawmaking happening at the local level that I think just putting aside polarization, causal relationship, people focusing on what is happening in their state legislatures or who's being elected to the state legislature is also, I think, an incredibly important component, that kind of the nationalization of politics, and especially the fact that people who are really deeply involved in politics are so focused at the national level that I think there is kind of this omission of a focus on what is happening around us, which is actually driving a lot of politics and kind of a lot of decision making.
One question, maybe you'll have a sense of this. This would just be like a knee-jerk, kind of response, or maybe you've thought about it. I really haven't. But let's say the local level becomes, or the state level becomes the focus. Does it then naturally follow that becomes sort of more polarized, just by virtue of getting the focus? Like, I don't know, if that's the case. I don't know if there are any, examples in history of, that those transitions, causing, that outcome. But I kind of, it's just an empirical question. I don't know.
Yeah, I would imagine it depends on what frame is given to it, right? If it's fit back into the national frame, then it's kind of the same polarization cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a totally empirical question.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So part of the reason I asked that question about local, kind of state and local issues is that I've had this, this feeling. I mean, like a lot of us observe that, say, municipal politics tends to be less partisan, partly because in some states, partisan, they're not partisan elections, and then that used to kind of prevent partisanship from seeping in. Now that's less the case. But I always thought that, well, it's hard to it's hard to talk a lot about divisive issues or partisan concerns when the real focus at the local level would be sanitation or the quality of infrastructure or public health matters, or clean water and clean air. Does that somehow does a focus on those kinds of issues keep the politics, or keep at least the extremism and the polarization out to some degree?
Maybe to some degree, but I go with what Jana just says. It depends on the issue. The old slogan, which you knew in politics, there's no partisan way to collect garbage, is true. On the other hand, school boards now we're seeing become intensely politicized as a direct result of the national debate over critical race theory and transgender and sexual orientation. And we see politicians at the local level exploiting that and using that. And to some extent that's their job. We see politicization of other issues at the local level as well. I had one at the tip of my tongue, but it escapes me now. So it's going to depend on the issue. But yeah, generally, I think, it's things look, James and Deborah Fallows wrote a book about this. Generally, America looks better from the bottom up than from the top down. In most places, civil society is not completely unraveling. In most places, a lot of people are still working together most of the time. A lot of cities and localities are still solving problems. And it would be good to focus more on that and to get more of those stories out and to remind ourselves that there is a world outside of Twitter and outside of national gotcha politics.
Yeah, but again, just to go back to, the media incentives, it's to attract a crowd, to attract an audience. And while that would be good, my sense is that garbage collection and pothole filling is not going to do that in the same way that book banning and, other contentious local issues, going back to what Yana said, how these things are framed, the media has incentives to frame coverage around and choose issues that are divisive.
Well, we're kind of running toward the end of our time together. One thing we didn't talk about was how it was was support for pluralism. This idea, there appeared to be in some of this data that there was a diminishing support in our country for the political rights of the people we disagree with. Yana, you've written about this to some degree. Do you want to talk about kind of what you're finding and whether whatever we could do to try to address the fact crisis might how that relates to people's unwillingness or diminished willingness to grant other people their rights?
Well, I think so. I can talk briefly, but I would kind of guide everyone. There's a recent Knight Foundation, really extensive report and really extensive study, really large survey on how people feel about things like political expression, freedom of speech, so these kinds of rights. The report breaks things up by partisanship, by gender, by race, by kind of a lot of these groups. So I think it's a really interesting kind of snapshot of where Americans are at. And Knight Foundation has done this for a number of years, so they have over time changes. But I think the other thing that really emerges from this work that I'm sorry to make everything like super boring about measurement, but it's my superpower, I guess. But the thing that I want to sort of stress that really emerges from the Knight report, and I should say I was an advisor on the report, is that it really depends how you ask people about these things. In the abstract, everyone is extraordinarily excited about letting everyone express all sorts of opinions. They're excited about people having all sorts of rights. But what changes is that once you give people concrete scenarios of what somebody might say with their freedom of speech, or the context in which somebody might protest, this is where we really kind of get differences and where we get kind of really important divisions, especially divisions by partisanship. So I think, again, there is this kind of consensus on this sort of like broad idea that, everyone should be allowed to express their opinions. People on the opposite side should be able to speak, but they shouldn't say that, right? Once you give people something concrete, they sort of hang on to it. But I think another really important thing that sort of emerges from this report is that when it comes to people feeling like they're welcome to exercise these rights, like they're welcome to share their opinions, and like if they shared their opinions, they wouldn't get punished for it. We have really kind of these important findings that, for example, African Americans don't feel comfortable, like they don't feel like they have as much sort of freedom to express rights. Women express similar ideas. So I think we have these partisan divisions for sure, but I think we also have to think about how people feel about their own ability to share their opinions, and how they feel their opinions would be kind of accepted by others if they were to share them. And some of these divisions are not by partisanship, they're by other kind of demographics that divide the country.
So Jim, right now, consistently in polls, 60+%, that's 60+% of Americans are saying that they are suppressing expressing their true political opinions for fear of offending someone or professional or job consequences. The percentage of students, unfortunately, is about the same, which is too bad because these are university students. I mean, universities are supposed to be places where people go to express creative and heterodox opinions. About a third of the public says that they are worried about losing their job or professional opportunities if they state their true opinions about politics. And that turns out to be true across the board. It does not vary significantly by ideology. People who identify as very progressive are as chilled as people who identify as very conservative. It's hard to compare eras, but it looks like the level of chilling in American society in terms of people being scared of expressing their true political beliefs is on the order of 3 to 4 times the level of 1954, just past the peak of the McCarthy era. I spoke earlier, we haven't talked about so-called cancel culture, but if we want to talk about a manipulated environment in which people feel disoriented, confused about truth, we should talk not only about the disinformation phenomenon that's primarily weaponized on the right, we should also talk about the tactics that are used to suppress heterodox and very often conservative opinions, predominantly on the left. That's also a source of real trouble and real resentment in the public, and that also needs attention.
I do it at least once every time. Mark or Yana, what are your thoughts about cancel culture? I do agree that we, time running short, but I do agree that is an issue that's worthy of discussion. Do either of you have any thoughts you'd like to share about that concept?
Well, the only thing that I can throw in that I think it might be of some value is the culture on college campuses. This is something, of course, that we experience as professors, and terrific member of our department, Tim Ryan, has done this very interesting study on the degree to which people feel like they can share their thoughts and opinions on campus. And a big concern among those on the right, is that students go off to college and are going to be inculcated with the beliefs of their faculty, and that it's their faculty who they're afraid to share their opinions around. In fact, what Tim's study actually shows is the people who, young people who are afraid to share their true opinions around are their peers. They feel like the faculty will, we're pros, right? We treat disagreement, as experts. We've been around it for a long time. But it's the peers who they're afraid of offending or being canceled by, and it's an absolutely real thing. And consistent with what John's suggesting, I don't think the ideological differences are that wide between students.
What about
They're not, and just to tie this back to the starting point of the whole conversation, Jim. We talked about sharing facts and staying fact-based as a society. Where facts and where knowledge comes from is vigorous, open, good faith disagreement. And if people are chilled and can't express entire viewpoints, then knowledge suffers. Then we can't learn as a society. We lose contact with reality.
So I want to just kind of build on 2 of those questions, and Yana, I really want to hear from you as well. But let me just interject. Mark, your response referred to the experience of students and their peers. That being their concern. What about faculty members and their peers?
Oh, that's a great question. I suspect that there's a lot of concern, about, just, mistakenly, innocently, saying, the wrong thing. It's funny. I used to be young and now I'm old. And I, feel that pressure. And again, not, I would like to think that I don't have a whole lot of animus in my heart, except for about those people I hate from before, but, not a lot of animus in my heart, but, I really worry, about offending, just mistakenly. So it's on my mind. I don't know that it changes my behavior that much, but it's definitely, I'm mindful. Maybe that's good.
A lot of professors are saying and telling me that they are at least on the margins, and sometimes more than that, pulling back in class. Things that they used to teach with confidence, they teach either less confidently or not at all, because it only takes one student to go on social media or file a complaint, and it's a big headache. But maybe it's good news, but I'm also hearing now from administrations in universities who are becoming aware of this problem and starting to try to think about, okay, it is a problem. How can we create a culture of real intellectual pluralism on campus? It's a long road, but at least I think there's growing awareness, and that's important.
Jana, you want to share any thoughts on this?
So I kind of returning, I think, to the Knight Foundation report. I think it's, if we look at the survey data of what people are kind of thinking through and how they sort of feel about a speech and kind of these other ideas, I think it is something that's really nuanced for a lot of people. I think a lot of people in the report, if I recall correctly, expressed a willingness, for example, to have their employers sort of kind of guide interactions and guide speech and sort of ensure that there wasn't anything offensive being said and so forth. So I think people are really, really kind of cognizant of that. And sort of just to kind of point, kind of speaking to what Mark and John said, awareness of how your speech might affect others can be really beneficial. Awareness of the way that others might experience something that you're saying, I think, can also help us as instructors guide the conversation and guide what we're teaching and what is happening. So I think thinking through how we're coming across to students is also is something that is not necessarily chilling, but something that at least contributes to education as well.
Well, I am looking at the clock and I've realized that we are over time, so I'm afraid I should probably bring this to a close. I want to thank our panelists, Mark, Jana, John. This has been a fascinating conversation and I've really enjoyed it with you. I also want to thank all of our attendees for joining us and for your excellent questions. I want to remind everybody, if you missed part of the conversation today or want to share with others, come back to the Levin Center's website. That's levin-center.org, where the event will be posted as a video recording of the event will be posted pretty shortly after we're done today. And we hope people can take advantage of this after the fact. As I mentioned at the top, this is the first of several conversations we plan to have exploring various aspects of this topic. So please follow us on social media and subscribe to our listserv and stay in touch with us regarding our events and programs. And with that, I want to thank everybody and wish you a good afternoon. So long.